When the billionaire walked into her cafeteria after 20 years, Maria Santos felt her carefully hidden secret rising to destroy everything she had left. He remembered exactly what she'd done for those two starving boys, and the look in his eyes told her he'd come to settle the debt. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Some acts of kindness are so small they barely register in the moment, yet their ripples can travel across decades, reshaping entire lives in ways no one could predict. For Maria Santos, a 42-year-old cafeteria worker at Lincoln Elementary School, compassion wasn't a grand gesture, it was simply who she was. For Marcus Thorne, one of the wealthiest men in the country, gratitude was a debt he'd carried for 20 years, waiting for the day he could finally repay it. Their worlds should never have intersected again after that difficult autumn when Maria quietly fed two hungry boys who had nothing. But fate has a way of circling back, of demanding that debts be acknowledged and stories be completed. This isn't a tale about charity. It's about the invisible threads that connect us all, about how a woman's simple act of feeding two forgotten children would one day stand between her and ruin, defended by the most powerful man she'd never expected to see again. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Lincoln Elementary's cafeteria, casting golden rectangles across the long tables where children laughed and ate. It was that particular quality of light that only exists in late September, warm but tinged with the coming chill of autumn. Maria Santos stood behind the serving counter, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, her blue uniform spotless despite the chaos of lunch service. She'd worked at Lincoln for 7 years, and she knew the rhythm of this place better than her own heartbeat. Clatter of trays, the excited chatter of young voices, the smell of institutional food that somehow still managed to be comforting. This was her kingdom, and these children were her charges, even if most of them didn't know her name. She watched the line move forward with the practiced eye of someone who'd served thousands of meals. There was Jenny Mitchell, who always asked for extra vegetables. There was Carlos Rodriguez, who'd only eat the chicken nuggets if they were shaped like dinosaurs. There was Emma Chun, who was allergic to dairy and needed special attention. Maria knew them all, knew their preferences and their restrictions, knew which ones came from homes where dinner was guaranteed and which ones didn't. That knowledge weighed on her more than she ever let on. Near the end of the lunch period, when most of the students had already been served and were settling into their conversations and games, two boys approached the counter. Maria had noticed them before, hovering near the edges of the cafeteria, their eyes following the other children with a hunger that went beyond physical need. They were new to the school, transfers who'd arrived just 2 weeks earlier. The older one looked about 9, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that were clean but worn thin. The younger one couldn't have been more than 7, his face still holding that softness of early childhood, but his eyes were too old, too wary. They were obviously brothers, bound together by more than blood, by the kind of shared hardship that creates an unbreakable bond. The older boy approached the counter with his shoulders squared, trying to project a confidence he clearly didn't feel. His younger brother stayed close behind him, one small hand gripping the back of the older boy's shirt like a lifeline. Maria's heart clenched. She'd seen this before, too many times. The signs were unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look. The older boy cleared his throat and said, his voice admirably steady, that they'd forgotten their lunch cards at home. It was a lie, and they both knew she knew it was a lie. His eyes darted to the trays of food still sitting under the heat lamps, and Maria saw him swallow hard. Behind him, the younger boy's stomach growled audibly in the relative quiet of the nearly empty cafeteria. Maria had worked in the school system long enough to know the rules. No payment meant no food. There were procedures, forms to fill out for free lunch programs, applications that required documentation and approval. There were systems in place, bureaucratic channels designed to help children exactly like these two. But systems took time, and these boys were hungry now. She glanced toward the cafeteria manager's office. The door was closed, and through the small window she could see her supervisor on the phone, deep in conversation. The decision took less than a second. Maria smiled at the boys, warm and genuine, and reached for 2 trays. She loaded them with food, not the meager portions dictated by the standard guideline, but real meal: chicken, rice, green bean, a roll, and a small carton of chocolate milk for each. She added a cookie to each tray, the kind usually reserved for special occasions. As she slid the trays across the counter, she leaned in slightly and said, her voice low and conspiratorial, that she knew how easy it was to forget those cards and that they shouldn't worry about it. They could just bring them tomorrow. Her eyes met the older boys, and in that moment a silent understanding passed between them. He knew she knew, and he knew she wasn't going to make them say it out loud. The relief that washed over the older boy's face was almost painful to witness. He tried to maintain his composure, to keep up the facade of normalcy, but his eyes betrayed him, glistening with tears he was too proud to shed. He managed a quiet thank you, his voice cracking slightly on the words. The younger boy, less practiced at hiding his emotions, broke into a smile so wide and genuine it could have lit up the entire room. They carried their trays to a table in the corner, and Maria watched as they ate with the single-minded focus of children who weren't sure when their next meal might come. They didn't talk much, didn't waste time. They just ate, savoring every bite as if it were a feast prepared by royalty. Maria turned back to her work, wiping down the counter and beginning the process of breaking down the lunch service. It was a small thing she'd done, so small it barely registered as she went through her routine. She'd given 2 hungry children some food. She'd bent a rule, yes, but only a little. And only because those boys needed help right now, not next week after forms were processed. She didn't think of herself as heroic or even particularly kind. She was just doing what felt right, what any decent person would do when faced with hungry children. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. The boys would come through the line, always near the end, always with the same excuse about forgotten lunch cards. And Maria would smile, load their trays with generous portions, and send them on their way. The cafeteria manager never noticed, or perhaps chose not to notice. The other workers saw but said nothing, recognizing in Maria's quiet defiance something they respected. It became their secret, hers and the boys', an unspoken pact that connected them across the divide of adult and child, helper and help. She learned their names, though not from them. The older one was Nathan, the younger was Ethan. She overheard their teacher mention they were living with an aunt temporarily, that there had been some kind of family trouble. She didn't pry, didn't ask questions. It wasn't her place, and these boys had clearly been asked enough questions already by social workers and administrators and well-meaning but overwhelming adults. What they needed from her wasn't interrogation. It was simply food and a smile that said they were seen, they mattered, and someone cared enough to make sure they didn't go hungry. Ethan, the younger one, began to warm to her first. He'd linger by the counter after getting his tray, telling her about his day in that rambling way young children have, where every detail is equally important. He'd tell her about the book they were reading in class, about the frog he'd seen in the playground, about how Nathan had helped him with his math homework. Maria would listen, really listen, nodding and asking questions and treating his stories with the seriousness they deserved. Nathan was more reserved, protecting his younger brother and himself with a shell of cautious distance. But even he began to relax around her, his shoulders losing some of their perpetual tension when he approached the counter, his rare smiles becoming slightly less rare. As October gave way to November, Maria noticed the boys looking a bit better. Their clothes, while still worn, seemed to fit better, as if someone had found them things in the right sizes. They looked less exhausted, less haunted. Nathan's protective vigilance over his brother eased slightly, though it never disappeared entirely. Whatever situation they'd been in seemed to be stabilizing, and Maria felt a quiet satisfaction knowing her small daily kindness had been part of that stability, even if it was just one warm meal in the middle of their difficult days. Then, as suddenly as they'd arrived, they were gone. Maria came to work one Monday in late November to find that Nathan and Ethan were no longer enrolled at Lincoln Elementary. She asked cautiously, trying not to seem too interested, and was told only that they'd moved, that their living situation had changed. No forwarding information, no details. They'd simply vanished from her life as quickly as they'd entered it. She felt their absence keenly, surprised by how much she'd come to care about these 2 quiet boys. For weeks, she found herself looking toward that corner table at the end of lunch service, half expecting to see them there. But the table remained empty, occupied by other children who had their own stories, their own struggles. Eventually, the sharp edge of their absence dulled into a gentle memory. Maria continued her work, feeding hundreds of children, noticing the ones who needed extra attention, bending rules when compassion demanded it. Nathan and Ethan became part of a mental gallery of children she'd helped over the years, their faces clear in her memory, but their stories incomplete. She hoped they were okay, wherever they'd gone. She hoped someone was still making sure they had enough to eat. 20 years passed. Maria Santos was 62 years old now, and her body reminded her of that fact every morning when she rose from bed. Her knees ached from decades of standing on hard cafeteria floors. Her lower back protested when she lifted heavy trays. The early morning alarm that had once been merely unwelcome now felt like an assault, but she still showed up, still tied on her blue uniform, still smiled at the children who passed through her line. Lincoln Elementary had been her home for 27 years, and despite the physical toll, despite the modest pay that never quite seemed to stretch far enough, she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. The cafeteria had changed over the years. New equipment had been installed, modern and efficient, but somehow less warm than the old setup. The menu had evolved to meet new nutritional guidelines, with more fresh vegetables and fewer of the comfort foods that had defined her early years. The children had changed too, or perhaps it was the world that had changed around them. More of them had smartphones now, even the youngest one. More of them dealt with anxieties that seemed impossibly heavy for such small shoulders. But the fundamental truth remained the same. Some children came from homes where love and food were abundant, and some didn't. Maria's job, as she saw it, was to make sure that during the hours they spent at Lincoln Elementary, every child was fed, and every child knew that someone cared. She still noticed the hungry ones, still recognized the sign, the way their eyes tracked the food with an intensity that spoke of uncertainty about the next meal, the way they ate slowly, savoring every bite, trying to make it last. Worn clothes, the 2 small shoes, the carefully maintained dignity that broke her heart more than any tears could. And when she spotted those children, she still found ways to add a little extra to their trays, to slip them an additional carton of milk or an extra piece of fruit. The rules had gotten stricter over the years, the oversight more intense, but Maria had also gotten better at knowing when to follow the rules and when compassion demanded otherwise. Her manager these days was a woman named Patricia Hendricks, a stern administrator in her 40s who ran the cafeteria with military precision. Patricia was efficient, organized, and utterly devoted to protocols and procedures. She kept meticulous records, tracked every item of inventory, and had been known to reprimand workers for portions that exceeded the standard guidelines by even small amounts. Maria and Patricia maintained a polite but cool relationship. Patricia respected Maria's experience and reliability. Maria respected Patricia's dedication, even if she found her approach unnecessarily rigid. They coexisted in a state of careful professional distance, each woman staying in her own lane. It was a Tuesday morning in early October when Maria's carefully balanced world began to tilt. She arrived at the school at 5:30 in the morning, as she had done for nearly 3 decades, and found an envelope taped to her locker in the staff room. Her name was written across it in Patricia's precise handwriting. Maria's stomach clenched with immediate anxiety. Notes on lockers were never good news. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a formal letter, typed and printed on school district letterhead, informing her that due to budgetary constraints and the need to restructure the food services department, her position was being eliminated at the end of the current school year. She would receive a modest severance package in recognition of her years of service, and the district thanked her for her dedication to the students of Lincoln Elementary. The words seemed to float on the page, refusing to make sense. Eliminated, severance, end of the school year. Maria read the letter 3 times, each reading bringing a new wave of shock and disbelief. After 27 years, after thousands of children fed, after becoming as much a fixture of Lincoln Elementary as the bricks and mortar themselves, she was being let go. The letter was polite, even complimentary, but its message was brutally clear. She was no longer needed. Maria sat down heavily on the bench in front of her locker, still holding the letter. She thought of her small apartment, the rent that had been raised twice in the past 3 years. She thought of her fixed income, the Social Security she wouldn't be eligible for until she turned 65. She thought of the modest savings account that was meant for emergencies but had been depleted and rebuilt, and depleted again over the years as life threw its inevitable challenges her way. 3 more years. She'd planned to work 3 more years to build up her savings a bit more, to reach the age where retirement wasn't just possible but sustainable, and now that plan was crumbling like dry bread in her hands. The cafeteria door opened and Patricia walked in, clipboard in hand, ready to begin her morning inspection routine. She saw Maria sitting there, the letter still clutched in her hand, and her expression shifted into something that might have been sympathy, though it was hard to tell behind her professional mask. Maria wanted to ask why, wanted to demand an explanation, wanted to know if there was anything she could do to change this decision, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew Patricia well enough to know that this decision hadn't been hers alone. This had come from above, from administrators and budget committees and people who looked at spreadsheets instead of faces. Patricia cleared her throat and said, her tone carefully neutral, that she knew this was difficult news, but that Maria should understand it wasn't personal. The district was facing significant budget shortfalls, and difficult decisions had to be made across all departments. Food services was being consolidated, and several positions across multiple schools were being eliminated. Maria's position had been selected based on a combination of factors including seniority costs and upcoming retirement eligibility. Patricia assured her that the decision had nothing to do with her performance, which had always been exemplary. The explanation was logical, reasonable even, but it felt like ice water in Maria's veins. She forced herself to stand, to fold the letter carefully and put it in her pocket, to nod and say she understood even though she didn't. Not really. She asked, her voice steadier than she felt, if she needed to work until the end of the school year or if there was an earlier date in mind. Patricia consulted her clipboard and said that Maria would be expected to work through the end of May, giving the district time to complete the restructuring process. That gave her about 8 months. 8 months to figure out how she was going to survive. The day passed in a blur. Maria went through her routine mechanically, serving lunch, cleaning up, preparing for the next day. The children were as boisterous and hungry as ever, unaware that the woman behind the counter was fighting to keep her world from falling apart. She smiled at them because that's what she did, because they deserved someone who smiled regardless of what was happening in her own life. But inside she felt hollow, scraped out, as if someone had taken everything that made her feel secure and stable and simply erased it. When her shift ended, Maria didn't go straight home. Instead, she found herself walking, her feet carrying her through the familiar streets of the neighborhood surrounding Lincoln Elementary. This had been her world for so long. She knew every corner, every small business, every face behind every counter. She walked past the small grocery store where she shopped, past the laundromat where she did her washing every Sunday, past the park where she sometimes sat on warm evenings and watched children play. Everything looked the same, but it all felt different now, as if she were seeing it through a pane of glass that separated her from the life she'd known. She thought about Nathan and Ethan, those 2 boys from 20 years ago. She thought about all the children she'd fed over the years, the ones who'd needed her small kindnesses to get through their difficult days. What would happen to them now? Would whoever replaced her notice the hungry one? Would they care enough to bend the rules when compassion demanded it? Or would they simply follow protocols, maintaining efficiency while children went without? That night, alone in her small apartment, Maria sat at her kitchen table and did math on the back of an envelope. Her rent, utilities, food, medication for the high blood pressure that had crept up on her in recent years. The numbers didn't work, even with the severance package, even if she was extremely careful. She would run out of money long before she qualified for Social Security. She could look for another job, of course, but at 62, in an economy that favored the young and tech-savvy, her prospects felt dim. The cafeteria work was all she knew, and those positions were apparently being eliminated across the district. For the first time in her adult life, Maria felt genuinely afraid. Not the everyday worry about making ends meet that had been her constant companion for decades, but real, bone-deep fear about what would happen to her. She thought about becoming one of those elderly women she sometimes saw, the ones who haunted grocery stores late at night, carefully calculating every purchase, choosing between food and medicine. She thought about losing her apartment, about where she would go, what she would do. The thoughts spiraled in her mind, each one darker than the last. But Maria Santos hadn't survived 62 years by giving up easily. She'd raised a daughter alone after her husband died young. She'd worked multiple jobs to keep a roof over their heads. She'd faced down bullying principals and unreasonable bureaucrats and made sure her daughter got a good education despite the obstacles in their path. She'd learned long ago that when life knocked you down, you got back up, dusted yourself off, and kept moving forward. The path ahead might be unclear and the odds might be against her, but she wasn't going to simply accept defeat. Over the following weeks, Maria began making inquiries. She called other schools in the district asking about openings. She contacted the few cafeteria workers she knew at other locations, asking if they'd heard of any positions. She looked at job listings online, squinting at the small print on her ancient computer, filling out applications for retail positions and cleaning jobs and anything else that seemed remotely possible. The responses, when they came at all, were polite rejections. Too many applicants, not enough experience in that particular field, budget constraints. The words varied, but the message was always the same. There was no place for her. At Lincoln Elementary, Maria continued her work, but now every interaction carried the weight of impending loss. She looked at the cafeteria with new eyes, memorizing details she'd taken for granted. The way the afternoon light fell through the windows, the particular squeak of the third table's bench, the faded mural on the far wall that some long ago art class had painted. This place had been her second home, and soon it would just be a memory. It was during one of these increasingly melancholy afternoon shifts that Maria noticed a black town car pulling up in front of the school. This wasn't unusual in itself. Parents came and went throughout the day, but there was something about this particular car, about the way it parked directly in front of the main entrance rather than in the designated pickup area, that caught her attention. She watched through the cafeteria windows as a man emerged from the back seat. He was tall, well-dressed in a way that spoke of serious money, and he moved with the kind of confidence that came from never having to ask permission for anything. He stood for a moment, looking up at the school building, and even from this distance, Maria could see something in his posture that spoke of deep emotion, carefully controlled. The man spoke briefly to someone, presumably a security guard or administrator, and then disappeared into the building. Maria turned back to her work, dismissing the incident. Rich people sometimes showed up at schools for various reasons: donations, board meetings, special programs. It had nothing to do with her. She had enough to worry about without adding curiosity about random visitors to the list. She couldn't have known in that moment that the man in the expensive suit was Marcus Thorne. She couldn't have known that he was one of the most successful entrepreneurs of his generation, worth billions, and she certainly couldn't have known that he was looking for her. Marcus Thorne stood in the hallway of Lincoln Elementary, and the smell of institutional cafeteria food hit him like a wave of memory so powerful it nearly knocked him back a step. It was a scent he'd thought he'd forgotten, buried under decades of five-star restaurants and private chefs and boardroom lunches served on fine china. But apparently the nose remembered what the mind had tried to move past. That particular combination of industrial cleaning, children's chaos, and mass-produced food transported him instantly back to a time when he was small and scared and hungry. Back to when he was Nathan Thorne and his little brother Ethan was the only constant in a world that seemed determined to break them both. The principal, a nervous woman named Dr. Sharon Bartlett, was talking to him, but Marcus was only half listening. She was saying something about how honored the school was by his visit, how they'd received his message about wanting to tour the facilities, how they were always grateful for the interest of successful alumni. Alumni, the word felt strange. He'd only attended Lincoln Elementary for 3 months, 20 years ago, during the darkest period of his childhood, but apparently that was enough for the school to claim him now that he was famous and wealthy. Marcus let Dr. Bartlett guide him through the hallways, nodding at appropriate moments, but his attention was elsewhere. He was scanning faces, looking at every adult they passed, searching for someone he wasn't even sure he'd recognize after 2 decades. The woman he remembered was younger, though he'd thought of her as old back then because all adults seemed old to a 9-year-old boy. She'd had kind eyes and a warm smile that reached those eyes, making them crinkle at the corners. She'd worn a blue uniform and had always seemed to know exactly what he and Ethan needed without making them say it out loud. Dr. Bartlett was explaining the school's recent improvements, their technology initiatives, their test score increases. Marcus made appropriate sounds of interest while his mind wandered back to that autumn 20 years ago. His mother had died in a car accident when he was 8 and Ethan was 6. Their father, who'd never been particularly stable, had completely fallen apart. For 6 months, they'd lived in a kind of controlled chaos, never quite knowing if there would be food in the house or if their father would be passed out on the couch when they got home from school. Then social services had stepped in, and they'd been sent to live with their Aunt Karen, their father's sister, in a different part of the city. Aunt Karen had meant well, but she'd been barely making ends meet herself, working 2 jobs and trying to take care of her own aging mother. Adding 2 traumatized boys to her household had stretched her resources past the breaking point. There hadn't been much food, and what little there was went to Marcus and Ethan because Karen, whatever her limitations, loved them and tried her best. She'd enrolled them at Lincoln Elementary, the school closest to her small apartment, and sent them off with promises that things would get better soon, that she was working on getting help from the state, that they just needed to hang on a little longer. Marcus remembered walking into that cafeteria for the first time, Ethan's small hand gripping the back of his shirt, both of them pretending they weren't absolutely starving. He tried to project confidence, to protect his little brother from the shame of their situation. And then there had been that woman behind the counter, with her kind eyes and her knowing smile, giving them food without making them admit they had no way to pay for it. Day after day, week after week, she'd fed them. She'd acted as if their obviously fabricated story about forgotten lunch cards was completely believable. She'd treated them with a dignity that had been in short supply in their young lives. It had only lasted 3 months. Aunt Karen, overwhelmed and unable to cope, had made the heartbreaking decision to place them in foster care, hoping they'd find a more stable situation than she could provide. Marcus and Ethan had been separated for the first time in their lives, sent to different homes. That separation had been agonizing, but it had also been temporary. Marcus, even at 9 years old, had been driven and determined. He'd been a model foster child, excelling in school, causing no trouble, impressing his temporary guardians with his maturity and focus. When he'd turned 18, his first act as a legal adult had been to petition for custody of Ethan, who was then 16 and had bounced through several placements. Against all odds, he'd been granted it. The years that followed had been a blur of hard work and calculated risks. Marcus had put himself through community college while working full-time and making sure Ethan stayed in school and out of trouble. He'd launched his first tech startup at 23 with borrowed money and sheer determination. That company had failed, but he'd learned from it. The second one had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, and by the time he was 30, he'd sold it for a sum that made him independently wealthy. He hadn't stopped there. He'd invested, started new ventures, built an empire that spanned multiple industries. Forbes had called him a visionary. Business magazines featured him on their covers. He'd become Marcus Thorne, billionaire entrepreneur, a name that carried weight in boardrooms and on Wall Street. But success hadn't erased the memories of being hungry. If anything, it had sharpened them, made them more precious and painful. He and Ethan, now a successful architect living across the country with a wife and 2 children, talked often about those difficult years. They'd agreed long ago that when they had the means, they would find that cafeteria worker, that angel in a blue uniform who'd shown them kindness when they'd needed it most. They'd tried before, several times, but the trail had always gone cold. The school had changed administrators multiple times. Records from that era were incomplete. They knew her first name had been Maria, but that was all they had. Then, 2 weeks ago, Marcus had been having lunch with an old college friend who happened to mention that his daughter attended Lincoln Elementary. Marcus had asked casually if they still had cafeteria workers who'd been there for a long time. His friend had laughed and said there was one woman who'd been there forever, a fixture of the place, though apparently she was being let go at the end of the year due to budget cuts. Her name was Maria Santos. Marcus had felt his heart stop. Maria. He'd made some calls, pulled some string, and confirmed that Maria Santos had indeed been working at Lincoln Elementary for 27 years, which meant she'd been there during that brief window when he and Ethan had attended. He'd had his assistant reach out to the school, arranging this visit under the pretense of a potential major donation. Now he was here, walking these halls, and the reality of the moment was crashing over him. Dr. Bartlett was leading him toward the cafeteria, still chattering about the school's programs and needs. Marcus's palms were sweating, something that never happened anymore. Not in boardrooms or during high-stakes negotiations or when he was being interviewed on national television. But the prospect of seeing this woman again, of finally being able to thank her and repay her kindness, had him feeling like that scared 9-year-old boy all over again. They rounded a corner, and the cafeteria came into view through a set of double doors with small windows. It looked different than he remembered, more modern, but the basic layout was the same. The serving counter, the long table, the big windows that let in the afternoon light. And behind that counter, wearing a blue uniform and wiping down a surface with methodical care, was a woman with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. Even from this distance, even after 20 years, Marcus knew her. It was something about the way she moved, the care she took with even the smallest tasks, the way her eyes lifted occasionally to survey the room as if checking on invisible children who needed her attention. Dr. Bartlett was saying something about the cafeteria's new serving system, about their Farm to School initiatives, but Marcus wasn't listening. He was walking toward the counter, his expensive shoes clicking on the tile floor, and the woman looked up at the sound. Her eyes met his, polite and professional, the look of someone used to dealing with parents and administrators and visitors of all kinds. There was no recognition in her gaze. Why would there be? He'd been a scrawny 9-year-old boy with too long hair and ill-fitting clothes. Now he was a 40-something man in a custom suit, his hair cut by an expensive stylist, his presence commanding rather than desperate. It changed completely. But she, despite the passage of time, despite the gray in her hair and the lines on her face, was unmistakably the same person who'd saved him and his brother. Marcus stopped a few feet from the counter, suddenly unsure how to begin. Dr. Bartlett was introducing him, saying something about Miss Thorne being a potential donor interested in seeing all aspects of the school's operations. The woman, Maria Santos, smiled politely and said it was nice to meet him, that she hoped he was impressed with what he saw. Her voice was the same, warm and genuine, and hearing it unlocked a floodgate of emotions Marcus hadn't prepared for. He found his voice and said, trying to keep it steady, that he actually had attended Lincoln Elementary many years ago, back in the fall of 1995. It had been a difficult time in his life, but he remembered the cafeteria staff being exceptionally kind. He watched Maria's face carefully, looking for any flicker of recognition, but there was only polite interest. Of course she wouldn't remember. How many thousands of children had passed through her line over the years? How many desperate, hungry children had she helped? He and Ethan were just two among countless others. Dr. Bartlett was beaming, delighted by this personal connection, saying how wonderful it was that former students returned to support their old schools. She asked Marcus if he remembered any of his teachers from that time, clearly hoping he'd make a sizable donation in someone's memory. But Marcus kept his attention on Maria, watching the way her hands had stilled on the counter, the way she was looking at him now with a slight tilt to her head, as if something in his face or voice had triggered a distant memory. He took a breath and said, his voice dropping lower, more intimate, that he'd been here with his younger brother Ethan. They'd only attended for a few months, but it had made a lasting impression. Maria's expression shifted subtly, a small crease forming between her eyebrows. Marcus pressed on, knowing he needed to give her more, needed to unlock the memory. He said they'd been going through a family situation at the time, that things had been uncertain, that they'd often forgotten their lunch cards. He emphasized the last part slightly and watched his understanding dawn slowly in Maria's eyes. Her hand came up to her mouth and she stared at him with an intensity that made Dr. Bartlett fall silent. Sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what, Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper, that she remembered two boys, brothers, who'd come through her line that autumn. The older one had always stood so straight, trying to be brave for his little brother. The younger one had the sweetest smile and had talked to her about everything and nothing. She asked, her eyes filling with tears, if that had been them, if Marcus was Nathan, and if Ethan was okay. Marcus felt his own throat tight. She'd remembered. After 20 years and thousands of children, she'd remembered them. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, he said that yes, he was Nathan, though he went by Marcus now, his middle. And Ethan was more than okay. He was happy, successful, married with children of his own. They'd both done well. And it was all thanks to people like her. People who'd shown them kindness when they'd needed it most. The tears that had been threatening to spill from Maria's eyes finally broke free, running down her cheeks in quiet streams. She pressed her hand more firmly against her mouth, trying to maintain some composure, but the emotion was overwhelming. Of all the children she'd helped over the years, Nathan and Ethan had stayed with her in a special way. She'd worried about them after they'd disappeared, had wondered for years what had become of those two brave boys who'd tried so hard to maintain their dignity in the face of impossible circumstance. And now here was Nathan, except he was Marcus now, standing before her in a suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months, telling her that they were both okay, that they'd survived and thrived. Dr. Bartlett looked completely bewildered, her professional smile frozen in place as she tried to understand what was happening. She clearly hadn't expected this visit to turn into such an emotional moment. She made a small throat-clearing sound and suggested that perhaps they should move to somewhere more private, that her office would be more appropriate for this conversation. But Maria shook her head, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. She said, her voice thick but insistent, that she was fine right here, that this was exactly where she needed to be. This cafeteria was where their story had intersected, and it felt right to have this moment here in the place where she'd first met those two scared boys. Marcus moved closer to the counter, and without thinking, Maria reached across it and took his hands in hers. They were strong hands now, confident and sure, but she remembered when they'd been small and hesitant, reaching for trays of food with a mixture of hunger and shame. She She told him how often she'd thought about him and Ethan, how she'd hoped they'd found their way to somewhere safe. She said she'd always regretted not knowing what happened to them, not being able to follow their story beyond those few months. Marcus squeezed her hands gently and told her not to regret anything, that what she'd done for them had been enough, more than enough. In a world that had been cold and uncertain, she'd been a point of warmth and safety. That had mattered more than she could possibly know. Dr. Bartlett, recovering from her initial confusion, was beginning to see the situation in a new light. Her eyes had taken on a calculating gleam, the look of an administrator recognizing an opportunity. She said, her voice warm with manufactured emotion, that this was exactly the kind of heartwarming story that illustrated what Lincoln Elementary was all about. Caring for students beyond just academics, making a real difference in young lives. She suggested that they should document this reunion, perhaps arrange for media coverage, show the community the lasting impact that their dedicated staff members had on students. It could be wonderful publicity for the school, especially during these difficult budgetary times. Marcus's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, and Maria saw the shift from the emotional man reconnecting with his past to the billionaire businessman who was used to people trying to use him for their own purposes. He said, his tone polite but with an edge of steel beneath it, that he'd prefer to keep this private for now. This was a personal matter, not a publicity opportunity. Dr. Bartlett's smile became slightly strained, but she nodded and said of course. She understood completely whatever Miss Thorne preferred. Maria could see the disappointment in the principal's eyes, the lost opportunity to leverage this reunion for the school's benefit. Marcus turned his attention back to Maria, his expression softening again. He asked if she had time to talk, really talk, not just a brief conversation interrupted by work obligations and hovering administrators. Maria glanced at the clock on the far wall. Her shift was technically over in 20 minutes, and the lunch service was long finished. She'd just been doing end-of-day cleanup, the kind of routine tasks that could wait. She nodded and said she could spare some time. Marcus asked Dr. Bartlett if there was somewhere private they could speak, and the principal, eager to accommodate despite being excluded from the publicity opportunity she'd envisioned, quickly offered her office. 10 minutes later, Maria found herself sitting in the principal's office, a space she'd rarely entered in her 27 years at the school. It was decorated with diplomas and certificates, photos of smiling students, and motivational posters about achievement and growth. Marcus sat across from her, and Dr. Bartlett had reluctantly excused herself after Marcus had made it clear he wanted to speak with Maria alone. The door closed behind the principal, and suddenly it was just the two of them, separated by 2 decades but connected by a bond forged in those difficult autumn months so long ago. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees, and began to tell her his story. He told her about the years after leaving Lincoln Elementary, about the foster care system, about his determination to reunite with Ethan. He told her about putting himself through school while working multiple jobs, about his first failed business venture, and the ones that had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. He told her about Ethan, who'd studied architecture and now designed sustainable housing projects, who had 2 children and a wife he adored. He spoke with pride about his brother, with gratitude for the people who'd helped them along the way, and with honesty about how hard it had all been. Maria listened, her heart swelling with a complex mixture of joy and sorrow. Joy that these boys had survived and flourished, that they'd beaten the odds stacked against them. Sorrow for the pain they'd endured, for the childhood that had been stolen from them. She told Marcus how proud she was of what he and Ethan had accomplished, how their resilience was a testament to their strength. Marcus shook his head and said it wasn't just resilience, it was the kindness of people like her that had made the difference. When everything in their world had been uncertain and frightening, she'd provided something stable and good. She'd fed them, yes, but more than that, she'd treated them with respect and dignity. She'd seen them as people who mattered, not as problems to be managed or pitied. He told her that he and Ethan had been trying to find her for years. They'd wanted to thank her, to let her know what her kindness had meant. Every year on the anniversary of that autumn, they raised a glass together and talked about the woman in the cafeteria who'd helped them when they'd needed it most. They'd made a pact that when they were successful enough, when they had the resources to properly express their gratitude, they'd find her and repay her kindness. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her a photo. It was Ethan with his family standing in front of a beautiful modern house, everyone smiling at the camera. Marcus pointed to the 2 young boys in the photo and said those were Ethan's sons, Nathan and Marco, named for the 2 versions of himself, the scared boy he'd been and the man he'd become. Maria felt fresh tears welling up. She told Marcus she didn't need thanks, that she'd only done what any decent person would do, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Many people wouldn't have risked their jobs to feed hungry children. Many people would have followed the rules and told those boys to go through proper channels. She'd chosen differently because she'd believed that some rules were less important than basic human compassion. Marcus smiled and said that was exactly his point. Not everyone would have made that choice, but she had, and that choice had rippled out in ways she couldn't have imagined. He asked about her life, her family. Maria told him about her daughter Rosa, who was now 35 and working as a nurse in another state. She was proud proud of Rosa, who'd grown up watching her mother work long hours to provide for them but had never complained, had always understood that they were doing the best they could. Rosa called every week, visited when she could, and had turned out to be a good person with a strong sense of service to others. Maria suspected that growing up watching her mother care for other people's children had influenced Rosa's decision to go into nursing. Marcus asked gently if Maria's husband was still alive, and Maria's face clouded. She explained that her husband had died in a workplace accident when Rosa was 10, that she'd been a widow for more than 2 decades. It had been the hardest period of her life, suddenly alone with a young daughter to raise and bills that didn't stop coming just because your heart was broken. But she'd survived, just as Marcus and Ethan had survived. You did what you had to do because giving up wasn't an option when someone depended on you. The conversation flowed easily, surprisingly so given the gulf between their lives. Marcus had the rare gift of making people feel comfortable, of asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite obligation. He asked about her work at the school, what had changed over the years, what challenges she faced. Maria found herself opening up in a way she rarely did, talking about the children she'd helped, the small victories and heartbreaking defeats that came with working in a system that often seemed designed to fail the most vulnerable. Then Marcus asked a question that made her stomach clench. He asked if she planned to continue working at Lincoln Elementary until retirement, if she saw herself here for the long term. Maria's face must have betrayed something because Marcus's expression immediately shifted to concern. He asked what was wrong, if something had happened, and suddenly Maria found herself telling him about the letter, about her position being eliminated, about the fear that had been eating at her for weeks. She hadn't meant to tell him. This reunion was supposed to be about joy and gratitude, not about burdening him with her problems. But the words came pouring out, all the anxiety and uncertainty she'd been holding inside. She told him about the 8 months she had left, about the severance package that wouldn't be enough, about the job market for 60-2-year-old cafeteria workers. She told him about the calculations she'd done on the back of envelopes, about the gap between when her job ended and when she'd be eligible for full Social Security benefits, about the very real possibility that she might lose her apartment and have nowhere to go. As she spoke, she watched Marcus's expression change from concern to something harder, something that reminded her that this wasn't just a grateful former student sitting across from her. This was a man who'd built an empire, who was used to solving problems and fighting injustice. When she finished, there was a long moment of silence. Marcus sat back in his chair, his jaw tight, his eyes distant as if he were running calculations in his head. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was calm but carried an unmistakable note of determination. He told Maria that she wasn't going to lose her job, and she wasn't going to lose her apartment. She started to protest, to say that she wasn't telling him this to ask for charity, that she would figure something out. But Marcus held up a hand, stopping her. He said this wasn't charity, this was justice. She had saved him and his brother when they were at their most vulnerable. She'd asked nothing in return, had expected nothing, but now she needed help, and he had the resources to provide it. More than that, he had the power to ensure that what was happening to her, the casual discarding of a dedicated worker after decades of service, didn't happen at all. He asked her to trust him, to give him a little time to make some calls and arrange some things. Maria wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her pride and her independence, but she was also exhausted from weeks of fear and stress, and the relief of having someone offer to help, someone who had both the means and the genuine desire to do so, was overwhelming. Marcus stood up and said he needed to make some calls, that he'd be in touch with her soon. He wrote his personal number on a business card and handed it to her, telling her to call him if she needed anything at all, before he'd had a chance to sort things out. Maria took the card, her hand trembling slightly, and looked at the name embossed on it. Marcus Thorne, CEO, Thorne Enterprises. It seemed impossible that the scared little boy who'd clutched his brother's hand in her cafeteria line had become this powerful man. But then again, she'd always seen something special in Nathan and Ethan, a resilience and determination that had made her believe they'd be okay someday. Marcus walked out of Lincoln Elementary with his mind already racing through strategies and solutions. The moment he reached his car, he was on the phone with his executive assistant, a supremely competent woman named Jennifer who'd been with him for 8 years and knew how to get things done. He told her to clear his afternoon schedule and get him everything she could find on the school district's budget, their administrative structure, and the decisions being made about staffing cuts. He wanted financial reports, meeting minutes, board member names, everything. Jennifer, used to her boss's sudden intense focus on unexpected matters, didn't ask questions. She simply said she'd have the information within 2 hours. By the time Marcus arrived back at his office, a sleek space on the 40th floor of a downtown tower, Jennifer had already sent him preliminary information. He spent the next several hours immersed in his business mind picking apart the district's financials with the same analytical precision he applied to potential investments. What he found made his blood boil. The district wasn't in nearly as dire financial straits as they'd claimed. Yes, there were budget pressures, but they weren't facing the kind of catastrophic shortfall that would justify eliminating experienced workers like Maria Santos. In fact, the district had recently approved significant salary increases for top administrators and had allocated substantial funds for a new administrative building. The staffing cuts in food services were a choice, not a necessity. They were cutting positions held primarily by older workers with higher seniority-based salaries, replacing them with fewer, younger, cheaper employees and increasing workloads for those who remain. It was a common corporate strategy, one Marcus himself had seen deployed countless times in various industries. Maximize profit margins by cutting labor costs at the bottom while protecting compensation at the top. In the private sector, it was ruthless but legal. In a public school system supposedly dedicated to serving children, it felt like a betrayal of mission. Marcus made a call to David Chun, an attorney who specialized in employment law, and owed Marcus a significant favor from a case several years back. He explained the situation, asking David what legal recourse Maria might have. David listened carefully and said that age discrimination could be a factor worth exploring, especially if the district was disproportionately targeting workers. However, he cautioned that these cases were difficult to prove and could take years to resolve. Maria needed help now, not after a prolonged legal battle. Marcus thanked him for the consultation and said he'd be in touch if they needed to pursue that angle, but he hoped to resolve this through other means. His next call was to Richard Blackwell, a member of the school district's board of directors. Marcus and Richard had served together on a charitable foundations board, and while they weren't close friends, they had a cordial professional relationship. Richard answered on the third ring, his voice friendly and curious. It wasn't often that Marcus Thorne called him directly. Marcus got straight to the point. He said he'd recently learned about the district's plan to eliminate several food service positions, including a worker at Lincoln Elementary who'd been there for 27 years. He asked Richard if he was aware of these cuts and what the rationale behind them was. Richard's tone became more guarded. He said the board had approved a restructuring plan proposed by the superintendent and the finance committee. It was about creating operational efficiencies and ensuring the district's long-term financial sustainability. These were difficult decisions, but they were necessary to protect the quality of education for students. Marcus noted the rehearsed quality of the response, the corporate jargon that translated to "we're cutting costs by eliminating experienced workers." He asked Richard directly if the board had considered the impact on the workers being let go, many of whom had dedicated decades to serving the district's children. Richard was quiet for a moment, then admitted with a hint of discomfort that the human element was always unfortunate in these situations. But the board had to look at the bigger picture. They had fiduciary responsibilities to the district as a whole. Marcus felt his temper rising but kept his voice measured. He told Richard that he hoped the board would reconsider this particular decision, that Maria Santos was an exemplary employee who'd made a real difference in countless children's lives, including his own. Richard sounded surprised and asked if Marcus had a personal connection to this case. Marcus confirmed that he did and that he took it very seriously. There was a longer pause and Marcus could almost hear the calculations happening on the other end of the line. Richard finally said, his tone carefully diplomatic, that the board always appreciated input from community members, especially those as prominent as Marcus. However, the restructuring plan had already been approved and implementation was underway. Reversing course would be complicated and might set problematic precedents. Marcus thanked Richard for his time and said he understood, but he hoped Richard would at least bring his concerns to the board's attention at their next meeting. Richard agreed, though his tone suggested it was a courtesy rather than a commitment to actual action. Marcus hung up, feeling frustrated but not defeated. If the polite approach wasn't going to work, he'd need to apply more pressure. He called Jennifer back and told her to arrange a meeting with the district superintendent, Dr. Harold Vance. He wanted it scheduled within the next 2 days. Jennifer asked if she should mention the purpose of the meeting. Marcus considered for a moment and then said to simply say that Marcus Thorne was interested in discussing potential philanthropic partnerships with the district that would get him in the door. What happened once he was there would depend on how reasonable Dr. Vance proved to be. That evening, Marcus called Ethan. His brother answered with the chaotic background noise of family life. Marcus could hear children laughing, the sounds of dinner being prepared, the warm domestic chaos that Ethan had built for himself. They exchanged brief pleasantries and then Marcus told him what had happened, that he'd found Maria Santos, that she'd remembered them, that she was facing termination from her job. Ethan's reaction was immediate and emotional. He asked if she was okay, what they could do to help. Marcus explained his plan to intervene with the school district, and Ethan said without hesitation that he was on board with whatever it took. That woman had saved them when they'd been at their lowest. There's no question about helping her now. They talked for nearly an hour, reminiscing about those months at Lincoln Elementary, about how Maria's kindness had been a bright spot in an otherwise dark time. Ethan said he wished he could be there, could see Maria again and thank her in person. Marcus promised that once this situation was resolved, they'd arrange a proper reunion, one where Ethan could bring his family and introduce his sons to the woman who'd helped their father and uncle survive. The conversation left Marcus feeling even more determined. This wasn't just about one woman's job. It was about honoring a debt that he and Ethan had carried for 20 years. About ensuring that goodness was rewarded rather than discarded when it became financially inconvenient. 2 days later, Marcus sat in the reception area of the district's central administrative building, a modern structure that looked far more expensive than a public school district office had any right to be. He noted the marble floors, the expensive artwork on the walls, the gleaming furniture that spoke of budgets that apparently had room for aesthetic choices but not for experienced cafeteria workers. After a 15-minute wait clearly designed to remind him that he was on their turf and their schedule, he was ushered into Dr. Vance's office. Dr. Harold Vance was a man in his late 50s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone who'd spent decades in educational administration. His office was large and well-appointed, with a view of the city and walls covered in framed degrees and commendation. He greeted Marcus with a firm handshake and a professional smile, gesturing to a leather chair across from his imposing desk. He thanked Marcus for his interest in supporting the district and launched into what was clearly a well-practiced pitch about the district's programs, challenges, and opportunities for philanthropic partnership. Marcus let him talk for a few minutes, nodding politely before holding up a hand to interrupt. He said, his tone pleasant but firm, that he appreciated the overview, but his interest in the district was actually quite specific. He was concerned about the recently announced restructuring of food services and the elimination of several long-term employees. Dr. Vance's expression shifted subtly, the warm salesman demeanor cooling into something more guarded. He said, echoing Richard's earlier language, that the restructuring was necessary for operational efficiency and long-term sustainability. These were difficult but important decisions made in the best interest of the district's mission to educate children. Marcus leaned forward slightly and said he understood that perspective, but he'd reviewed the district's financials and he had questions about whether these cuts were truly necessary or simply convenient. He mentioned the administrative salary increases, the new building project, the ways the budget seemed to have flexibility when it came to top-level expenditures, but not for the workers who actually served children their meals every day. Dr. Vance's expression hardened. He said with an edge to his voice that he wasn't sure where Marcus had gotten his information, but the district's internal financial decisions were made by qualified professionals with full knowledge of the complex factors involved. It wasn't appropriate for outsiders, however well-intentioned, to question those decisions without understanding the full picture. Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He said he understood Dr. Vance's position, but he wanted to make his own position equally clear. Maria Santos had been an exemplary employee for 27 years. She'd gone above and beyond her job description to ensure hungry children were fed. She represented exactly the kind of dedicated staff member that any organization should value and protect. Her termination was not only unjust, but it sent a terrible message about what the district actually valued. He was formally requesting that the district reconsider her termination and find a way to keep her employed until she was ready to retire on her own terms. Dr. Vance's expression was now openly hostile. He said, his voice cold, that employment decisions were internal matters, and the district didn't make personnel changes based on external pressure, regardless of who was applying that pressure. Maria Santos's position had been eliminated as part of a broader restructuring plan. It wasn't personal and it wasn't negotiable. He suggested that if Marcus was genuinely interested in supporting the district, there were many productive ways to do so that didn't involve interfering with administrative decisions. Marcus stood up, his full height and presence suddenly dominating the room in a way that sitting hadn't conveyed. He said, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable steel, that Dr. Vance had misunderstood the nature of this conversation. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was giving Dr. Vance an opportunity to do the right thing before other, less pleasant options became necessary. He had significant resources, significant connections, and a significant platform. If the district chose to proceed with terminating Maria Santos, he would ensure that the decision received scrutiny, that the district's financial priorities became very public, and that voters in the district understood exactly how their tax dollars were being spent. The threat was clear, and Dr. Vance's face flushed with anger. He said Marcus was welcome to do whatever he thought appropriate, but the district would not be bullied into reversing sound policy decisions by wealthy individuals who thought money gave them the right to dictate how public institutions operated. Marcus headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. He said that Dr. Vance would be hearing from him again soon, and he hoped the superintendent would use the intervening time to reconsider his position. Then he walked out, leaving Dr. Vance standing behind his expensive desk in his expensive office, radiating impotent fury. Maria knew something was happening, though she didn't understand what. 3 days after Marcus's visit, Patricia Hendricks had called her into the small office adjacent to the cafeteria and asked, her tone unusually nervous, if Maria had recently been in contact with anyone from outside the school district regarding her employment situation. The question had been phrased carefully, almost legally, as if Patricia were following a script. Maria had admitted that yes, a former student had visited and they'd discussed her upcoming termination. Patricia's expression had tightened, and she'd said that Maria should be aware that employment matters were confidential internal affairs, and discussing them with external parties could be considered a violation of district policy. The implied threat had been clear, though Patricia hadn't stated it outright. Maria was being warned not to make waves, not to bring outside attention to a situation the district wanted to handle quietly. She'd left that meeting feeling even more anxious than before. Had telling Marcus about her situation been a mistake? She hadn't asked him to intervene. She'd simply shared her fears with someone who'd seemed genuinely interested. But now the district was circling wagons, and Maria found herself caught in the middle of something she didn't fully understand. She'd considered calling Marcus using the number on the business card she'd tucked into her wallet, but what would she say? that she was scared of retaliation, that the district seemed angry about something. It felt like dragging him further into her problems, and she'd already revealed more than she'd intended. So she kept her head down, did her work, and tried to ignore the way Patricia watched her with an intensity that hadn't been there before. Meanwhile, Marcus was escalating his campaign. His meeting with Dr. Vance had made it clear that polite requests and veiled threats wouldn't be enough. The district administration was entrenched in their position, confident that their authority was unassailable. They'd underestimated him, assumed that his wealth and influence stopped at the doors of public institutions. Marcus was about to teach them otherwise. He started with research, having his team compile a comprehensive report on the district's spending over the past 5 years. The data was illuminating and damning. Administrative salaries had increased by an average of 18%, while teacher salaries had risen by only 4%. The food services budget had been cut by 12%, even as student enrollment had grown. Meanwhile, the district had spent millions on a consulting firm to develop a strategic plan that, as far as Marcus could tell, had resulted in nothing but glossy reports that gathered dust on shelves. He had his media team, normally used for managing his company's public relations, prepare a detailed presentation of these findings, charts, graphs, comparative analyses with other districts. It was the kind of data journalism that newspapers love because it told a clear story that regular people could understand. Your tax dollars are being spent on administrators and consultants while the people who feed your children are being fired. Then he made calls to journalists he knew, reporters who covered education policy and local government. He didn't hand them the story outright. That would have been too obvious and might have backfired. Instead, he mentioned casually that he'd been looking into the school district's budget and had found some interesting patterns. Would they like to see the data? Several expressed immediate interest. Marcus also reached out to parent organizations and community groups. He was careful not to make this about him or even specifically about Maria. He framed it as a broader issue of priorities and values. When school districts claimed they had to cut services to children, it was worth examining where the money was actually going. Were they really facing insurmountable financial challenges? Or were they making choices that protected the comfortable while sacrificing those who did the hard work of actually serving students? The message resonated. Parents who were already frustrated with the district's decisions began asking questions at school board meetings. Why were food service positions being eliminated while administrative staff was growing? Why were experienced workers being let go in favor of restructuring that seemed to benefit management rather than students? The pressure began to build. A local newspaper ran a front-page story about the district's spending priorities, complete with the data Marcus's team had prepared. The headline read, "Administrative costs up, cafeteria workers out, questions about district priority." The article didn't mention Marcus or Maria by name, but it created exactly the kind of public scrutiny that Dr. Vance had wanted to avoid. Letters to the editor flooded in, many from parents and former students sharing stories of cafeteria workers who'd gone above and beyond, who'd been the caring adults that some children needed. The issue was no longer abstract budget policy. It had become personal and emotional. At Lincoln Elementary, Maria felt the shift in atmosphere. Teachers began stopping by the cafeteria to tell her how much they appreciated her work, how wrong it was that she was being let go. Parents she'd known for years hugged her in the hallways and told her they were fighting for her job. It was touching but also overwhelming. She hadn't asked to become the face of this issue, hadn't wanted this kind of attention. She was a private person who preferred to do her work quietly without fanfare. Now she felt exposed, caught in a spotlight she'd never sought. Patricia Hendricks was coldly furious. She cornered Maria one afternoon and said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, that she knew Maria had to be the source of the information that had leaked to the media. Maria protested that she hadn't spoken to any reporters, that she didn't even know what information Patricia was talking about. Patricia's eyes narrowed with disbelief. She said that Maria's friend, the billionaire, had to have gotten his information from somewhere, and there would be consequences if it could be proven that Maria had violated confidentiality policies. The accusation was unjust, and Maria wanted to defend herself, wanted to point out that budget information was public record and anyone could access it. But she was tired, scared, and unsure of her rights. So she simply said she hadn't done anything wrong and walked away, feeling Patricia's hostile stare following her. That evening, Maria finally called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, his voice immediately warm and concerned when he heard who it was. She told him what was happening at the school, the hostile environment, the accusations, the feeling that she was being watched and judged. Her voice shook as she spoke. All the accumulated stress of the past weeks finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said something that surprised her. He apologized. He said he'd been so focused on fighting the injustice of her termination that he hadn't fully considered how his actions might impact her day-to-day life at the school. He'd made her situation more visible, and in doing so, had made her vulnerable to retaliation. Maria wiped at her eyes, touched by his genuine remorse. She told him she didn't blame him, that he was trying to help, but she admitted she was scared. What if the district found a reason to fire her before her termination date? What if they made these last months so unbearable that she had to quit? She needed this job, needed the income for as long as she could keep it. Marcus's voice took on that quality of steel she'd heard when he'd spoken about helping her. He told her not to worry about retaliation. If the district took any adverse action against her beyond the already planned termination, he had lawyers who specialized in employment law, and they would bury the district in litigation so fast their heads would spin. He promised her that she was protected, that he wouldn't let them hurt her. The reassurance helped, but Maria still felt uneasy. She thanked Marcus and ended the call, but sleep was difficult that night. She kept thinking about how quickly her quiet life had been upended, how a chance encounter with a man from her past had turned into a public battle she'd never wanted to fight. She believed Marcus had good intentions. She knew he was genuinely trying to help, but she also understood that for him, this was one fight among many, a problem to be solved with resources and influence. For her, this was her entire life, her livelihood, her sense of security, all hanging in the balance. The school board meeting the following Tuesday was packed. Normally these meetings drew a handful of people, mostly district employees and the occasional engaged parent, but this time the chamber was full. Parents, teachers, community members, and media all crowded into the space. Maria hadn't planned to attend. She'd never been to a school board meeting in her life and had no desire to put herself in the middle of what she knew would be a contentious event, but several teachers had encouraged her to come, had told her that her presence would matter, would remind the board that they were talking about a real person's life and not just budget line items. So she'd reluctantly agreed, sitting in the back row and hoping to remain anonymous in the crowd. Marcus was there too, though he sat separately from Maria. He dressed more casually than usual, in slacks and a button-down shirt rather than his typical suit. He was trying, she realized, not to look like an intimidating billionaire, but rather like a concerned community member. It was a calculated choice, and she could see the strategic thinking behind it. During the public comment period, speaker after speaker approached the microphone. Parents talked about cafeteria workers who'd shown kindness to their children. Teachers spoke about the importance of support staff who were often undervalued. Community members questioned the district's priorities and demanded transparency about how decisions were being made. Marcus spoke last, and his comments were carefully crafted. He introduced himself not as a billionaire, CEO, but as a former student of Lincoln Elementary who'd benefited from the care of dedicated staff members. He spoke about the data, about the concerning trends in spending, about the need for accountability. He never mentioned Maria by name, never made it personal, even though everyone in the room knew this fight had started because of her, but his words carried weight. He spoke with the authority of someone used to boardrooms and negotiations, but also with genuine emotion about the importance of honoring those who serve children. The board members listened with varying degrees of attention and discomfort. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared defensive. Dr. Vance sat off to the side, his expression neutral but his body language tense. When the public comment period ended, the board chair thanked everyone for their input and said the board would take all concerns under advisement as they continued to evaluate district policy. It was a non-committal response that satisfied no one. As people filed out of the chamber, Maria felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Marcus standing there. He asked how she was holding up, and she admitted she was exhausted. This public battle wasn't her nature. She was a behind-the-scenes person, someone who did her work without needing recognition or attention. Now she felt like a symbol, cause, and it was deeply uncomfortable. Marcus nodded with understanding. He said he knew this was hard, that he knew she'd never asked for any of this, but he also told her something that stuck with her. He said that sometimes the right fights found you whether you wanted them or not. She'd spent her entire career quietly fighting for children who needed someone to care. Now it was her turn to be fought for, and she needed to let people who cared about her do that fighting. It wasn't about ego or attention. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable. His words resonated, but they didn't make the situation easier. Maria went home that night feeling pulled in multiple directions, grateful for the support, but anxious about where all of this was heading. The district's response to the mounting pressure was to dig in deeper. Dr. Vance released a statement defending the restructuring plan, calling it a necessary modernization of food services that would ultimately benefit students. He characterized the public opposition as misguided sentimentality that failed to understand the complex realities of education. The statement was professionally written but tone-deaf, dismissive of legitimate concerns, and clearly designed to frame critics as emotional and uninformed. It had exactly the opposite effect of what was intended. Rather than quieting the controversy, it inflamed it further. Parents and community members who might have been willing to give the district the benefit of the doubt now felt insulted and dismissed. Marcus read the statement and felt a grim satisfaction. Dr. Vance was making mistakes, letting his ego and defensiveness drive his decisions rather than strategic thinking. Every statement, every dismissive gesture, every attempt to characterize legitimate concerns as mere emotion was digging the district's hole deeper. Marcus had seen this pattern before in business context. Leaders who were more concerned with being right than with being effective, who confused stubbornness with strength. They rarely ended well. But he also knew that cornered bureaucrats could be dangerous. When they felt their authority threatened, they often lashed out in ways that hurt the most vulnerable people in the situation. He worried about Maria, about what the district might do to make her life difficult in ways that were hard to prove or fight. His concerns proved justified when Maria called him 3 days after the board meeting. Her voice was shaky, barely holding back tears. She told him that Patricia Hendricks had written her up for a violation of food safety protocols. The accusation was that Maria had served food past its use-by, a serious offense that could potentially result in immediate termination for cause rather than the planned elimination of her position at the end of the school year. Maria insisted she hadn't done anything wrong, that she'd followed the same procedure she'd followed for 27 years. But Patricia had documentation, an incident report signed by another cafeteria worker who Maria considered a friend, stating that Maria had been observed serving yogurt that was 2 days past its marked date. Marcus listened carefully, asking questions about the process, about witnesses, about the specific claims. He could hear the fear in Maria's voice, the understanding that this was retaliation designed to either force her out early or build a case that would eliminate any sympathy for her situation. He told her to document everything, to write down exactly what happened, when it happened, and who was present. He told her not to sign anything without reviewing it first, and if the district tried to force her into any meetings without representation, she should call his attorney immediately. He gave her David Chun's number and told her David was already briefed and ready to help. Maria thanked him, her voice breaking, and Marcus felt a surge of anger at people who would weaponize bureaucratic procedures against a woman who'd devoted her life to serving children. He called David Chun immediately after hanging up with Maria. David confirmed that the timing and nature of the write-up strongly suggested retaliation, which would be illegal. However, proving it would require demonstrating that the underlying accusation was false, or that the district's enforcement of the policy was selective and motivated by Maria's protected activity. The challenge was that food safety violations were subjective in many cases, and districts had broad discretion in how they enforced their own policies. David said he could defend Maria if it came to a termination hearing, but preventing the write-up from happening in the first place would be difficult. The best strategy was to continue applying pressure to the district from multiple angles, making it clear that any further actions against Maria would be scrutinized intensely. Marcus escalated his own efforts. He reached out to the state education department, filing a formal complaint about the district's spending practices and requesting an audit of their budget decisions. He knew this would take months to process, but it sent a message that the scrutiny wasn't going away. He also contacted the teachers union, which had remained largely silent on the food services restructuring. He met with the union president, a sharp woman named Teresa Gomez, who'd been in her position for over a decade. Teresa was initially guarded, explaining that the union represented teachers, not cafeteria workers, so their ability to intervene was limited. But Marcus pointed out that the district's pattern of eliminating experienced workers to cut costs while protecting administrative salaries was a threat to everyone. Today it was cafeteria workers. Tomorrow it could be teachers with high seniority. The fight was connected. Teresa listened thoughtfully and admitted he had a point. She said the union couldn't officially represent Maria, but they could issue a statement expressing concern about the district's priorities and the treatment of long-term employees. They could also attend board meetings and make their presence known. It wasn't as much as Marcus had hoped for, but it was something. Another voice, another source of pressure. The union released their statement 2 days later, carefully worded to express solidarity with all district workers facing job insecurity while stopping, short of specifically advocating for Maria. But the media coverage framed it as the teachers' union weighing in against the district's restructuring plan, adding another dimension to the growing controversy. At Lincoln Elementary, the atmosphere had become increasingly toxic. Maria felt eyes on her constantly. Patricia Hendricks seemed to be documenting her every move, appearing at unexpected times with a clipboard and a critical expression. Other cafeteria workers were clearly uncomfortable, caught between their loyalty to Maria and their fear of becoming targets themselves. The woman who'd signed the incident report about the yogurt, a younger worker named Jennifer who Maria had trained and mentored, could barely look at her. Maria understood. Jennifer had 2 small children and couldn't afford to lose her job. When Patricia had asked her to sign the report, she'd probably felt she had no choice. Maria didn't blame her, but the betrayal still stung. The children, blessedly, remained unchanged. They still came through the line with their endless energy and chatter, still smiled at Maria and thanked her for their food, still treated her with the unconscious kindness that children often possessed. It was for them that Maria kept showing up, kept doing her job with the same care and attention she'd always brought to it. Whatever else was happening, these children still needed to be fed, still deserved to have someone who cared about them serving their meals. She wasn't going to let the district's dysfunction change that. Marcus, meanwhile, was exploring another avenue. He'd been thinking about Dr. Vance's stubbornness, about what might be driving it beyond simple bureaucratic territoriality. He had his research team look deeper into the superintendent's background, his connections, his career trajectory. What they found was interesting. Dr. Vance had been hired 5 years ago with strong backing from a particular board member, Gerald Sampson. Sampson owned a consulting firm that had subsequently received several lucrative contracts from the district, including the multi-million-dollar strategic planning project. The relationship might have been perfectly legal, but it suggested a network of mutual interest that might explain why Vance was so resistant to having the district's spending scrutinized. Marcus had his team dig deeper into Sampson's firm and the contracts they'd been awarded. The more they looked, the more questions emerged. Bid processes that seemed designed to favor Sampson's Sampson's firm. Deliverables that were vague and difficult to evaluate, payments that continued even after projects were supposedly completed. It was starting to look less like routine cronyism and more like potential corruption. Marcus wasn't interested in destroying careers or exposing scandals for their own sake, but if people were enriching themselves through questionable deals while eliminating the jobs of workers like Maria Santos, he had no qualms about bringing those facts to light. He met with an investigative journalist named Sarah Chun, who'd built a reputation for exposing government waste and corruption. He laid out what his team had found, providing documentation and suggesting lines of inquiry that Sarah might want to pursue independently. Sarah was intrigued, but cautious. She said she'd need to verify everything independently, do her own research, and find additional sources. She couldn't simply take Marcus's word for it, regardless of his reputation. Marcus respected that. He wanted legitimate journalism, not a hit piece. He told Sarah he understood that he'd provided the information because it was in the public interest, and what she did with it was up to her. As Sarah began her investigation, the pressure on the school board continued to mount from multiple directions. The state education department confirmed they'd received Marcus's complaint and would be conducting a review. The teachers' union began attending board meetings regularly, a visible presence that reminded everyone of organized labor's potential power. Parents continued to speak out, and the media coverage remained steady. Individual board members who'd initially supported the restructuring plan without much thought were now fielding angry calls and emails from constituents. Several were facing re-election in the coming year and were beginning to understand that this issue might actually threaten their positions. Richard Blackwell, the board member Marcus had initially contacted, requested a private meeting. They met at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant where they could talk without being overheard. Richard looked tired and stressed. He told Marcus with surprising candor that the situation had spiraled beyond what anyone had anticipated. The board had approved the restructuring plan based on Vance's recommendation and Sampson's assurances that it was fiscally necessary. Now they were being accused of mismanaging funds and betraying workers. Some board members wanted to reverse course, but Vance was insisting that backing down would undermine his authority and set a terrible precedent. The board was divided and paralyzed by indecision. Marcus listened patiently and then asked Richard directly what it would take to resolve the situation in a way that protected Maria Santos and sent a message that the district valued its workers. Richard sighed and said honestly that it would require Vance to agree to some kind of compromise, or it would require the board to overrule him, which would likely lead to Vance's resignation. Neither option was simple. Marcus pointed out that Vance's position was becoming increasingly untenable. The audit would eventually reveal questionable spending decisions. Sarah Chun's investigation would likely uncover the relationship between Vance and Sampson. The longer this dragged on, the worse it would get for everyone involved. The smart play was to find a graceful exit now while that was still possible. Richard absorbed this, clearly recognizing the implicit threat. He asked what Marcus wanted specifically. Marcus said he wanted Maria Santos's position restored with an apology for the hardship she'd been put through. He wanted the district to commit publicly to valuing experienced workers and to implementing a more transparent process for budget decisions. And he wanted assurance that there would be no retaliation against Maria for any of this. If those things happened, he'd back off, stop the pressure campaign, and even consider making a substantial donation to support programs that actually benefited students. Richard said he'd take that back to the board, that he'd do what he could to broker a resolution. But he warned Marcus not to expect quick movement. Bureaucracies move slowly, and pride made them move even slower. Maria, unaware of these behind-the-scenes negotiations, was simply trying to survive day by day. The write-up remained in her file, a pending threat that could be activated at any moment. She'd met with David Chun, who'd been kind and reassuring but also realistic about the challenges they'd face if the district decided to pursue termination for cause. The best defense was to be absolutely perfect in her work, to follow every procedure to the letter, to give them no additional ammunition. It was exhausting, turning her familiar routine into a high-wire act where any misstep could be catastrophic. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Sarah Chun's investigation had been thorough and methodical, following paper trails and conducting interviews with current and former district employees. She discovered that Gerald Sampson's consulting firm had been awarded contracts worth over $4 million in the past 3 years, many of them through processes that bypassed competitive bidding. The justification had always been that Sampson's firm possessed specialized expertise that made them uniquely qualified. But when Sarah had examined the actual work products delivered, she'd found generic reports that could have been produced by any competent consulting firm for a fraction of the cost. What really broke the story open was a conversation Sarah had with a former district finance officer named Margaret Walsh. Margaret had retired 2 years earlier after 30 years with the district, and she'd been increasingly troubled by what she'd witnessed in her final years. She told Sarah that she'd raised concerns about the Sampson contracts multiple times, pointing out irregularities in the approval process and questioning whether the district was getting value for its money. Her concerns had been dismissed, and she'd been quietly pushed toward early retirement. Margaret had documentation, emails she'd saved before leaving, showing that she'd flagged these issues and been told explicitly by Dr. Vance to stop questioning board-approved contracts. Sarah's article ran on a Sunday morning, front page above the fold, with a headline that read, "Consulting Contracts Under Scrutiny, Questions About School District Spending and Board Members' Firm." The piece was devastating in its calm, factual presentation. It laid out the timeline of Sampson's relationship with Vance, the contracts that had been awarded, the lack of competitive bidding, and the concerns raised by Margaret Walsh. It noted that while nothing definitively illegal had been proven, the pattern raised serious questions about conflicts of interest and whether the board member with financial ties to the superintendent should have been voting on budget matters that affected his own firm's income. The response was immediate and explosive. By Monday morning, the district's phone lines were jammed with calls from angry parents and taxpayers. The state education department announced they were expanding their review to include the consulting contracts. The county prosecutor's office issued a statement saying they were aware of the allegations and evaluating whether there was basis for an investigation. Gerald Sampson released a statement through his lawyer insisting that all contracts had been properly awarded and that his firm had delivered quality work. Dr. Vance said he stood by every decision he'd made and that the contracts had been necessary investments in the district, but their defenses sounded hollow in the face of Sarah's meticulous documentation. The school board called an emergency meeting for Tuesday evening. The chamber was packed even fuller than before, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Television cameras lined the back of the room and reporters from multiple outlets filled the press section. This had become a major story, not just about cafeteria workers or budget cuts, but about potential corruption and the misuse of public funds. Maria attended, sitting in the same back row she'd occupied before, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what this had become. She'd simply wanted to keep her job, to avoid losing her apartment, to make it through a few more years until she could retire. Now she was at the center of a scandal that might bring down district leadership. Marcus was there too, sitting a few rows ahead of Maria. He'd dressed formally this time, in a dark suit that announced he was there in an official capacity, not as a casual observer. Before the meeting started, he'd turned around and caught Maria's eye, giving her a small nod of reassurance. The gesture was simple, but it steadied her, reminded her that she wasn't alone in this. The meeting began with the board chair, a woman named Ellen Rodriguez, reading a prepared statement. Her voice was strained, and it was clear she hadn't slept well. She said that the board took the allegations in the recent news article very seriously and would be conducting a thorough review of all consulting contracts and bidding processes. She announced that Gerald Sampson had voluntarily recused himself from all budget-related votes pending the outcome of this review, though he maintained his innocence of any wrongdoing. Then came the part that made the room go silent. Ellen said that the board had also been reviewing the food services restructuring plan in light of community concerns and new information about the district's overall financial situation. After careful consideration and extensive discussion, the board had determined that the elimination of certain long-term food service positions was not, in fact, necessary for the district's financial sustainability. The restructuring plan would be revised to preserve these positions, and employees who had received termination notices would have those notices rescinded. The announcement was delivered in careful legal language, but its meaning was clear. Maria's job was safe, would not be terminated at the end of the school year. She could stay. Maria felt the room spin slightly. She gripped the edge of her seat, trying to process what she'd just heard. Around her, people were reacting with applause and cheers, but it all seemed distant, muffled, as if she were underwater. This was what Marcus had been fighting for. This was the resolution he'd promised, but it felt surreal, impossible to fully believe. After months of fear and stress, after resigning herself to an uncertain future, she was simply being told that everything was fine, that she could go back to her normal life, except nothing felt normal anymore. Dr. Vance sat stiffly at the leadership table, his face a mask of controlled fury. He hadn't been consulted on this decision, or if he had, he'd been overruled. His authority had been publicly undermined, and everyone in the room could see it. Ellen Rodriguez continued, saying that the board would also be implementing new policies to ensure greater transparency in budget decisions and contract awards. They would be forming a community oversight committee to review district spending and provide input on financial priorities. It was a complete capitulation to the demands that had been building over the past weeks, a recognition that the district's leadership had lost the confidence of the community it served. During the public comment period, dozens of people spoke. Most praised the board's decision, though several pointedly noted that it shouldn't have taken a media scandal to force them to do the right thing. Teachers spoke about the importance of valuing all staff members, not just those in administrative positions. Parents talked about their children's relationships with cafeteria workers who'd shown them kindness and care. Several people specifically mentioned Maria Santos by name, thanking her for her years of service and expressing relief that she'd be able to continue her work. Maria felt tears streaming down her face, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming emotion. She'd spent her entire career trying to remain invisible, to do her work without recognition. Now she was being publicly celebrated, and it was both touching and deeply uncomfortable. Marcus spoke during the public comment period, keeping his remarks brief. He thanked the board for their decision and said he hoped this represented a genuine commitment to changed priorities, rather than just a response to public pressure. He announced that he would be making a donation of $2 million to the district. to be used specifically for programs that directly benefited students, including upgrades to kitchen equipment and school cafeterias and expanded free meal program. The donation was structured with strict oversight provisions to ensure the money was spent as intended. It was both a generous gift and a pointed message. Marcus was willing to support the district, but only if they demonstrated they'd learned from this experience. After the meeting ended, Maria found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Teachers hugged her, parents thanked her, people she barely knew offered their congratulations. It was overwhelming, and she felt herself starting to panic from the sheer number of bodies and voices pressing in around her. Suddenly, Marcus was there, gently but firmly creating space, telling people that Maria had been through a lot and needed some air. He guided her out of the building into the cool evening, away from the crowds and cameras. They stood in the parking lot under the yellow glow of streetlights, and Maria finally allowed herself to fully break down. She sobbed, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep inside, releasing months of accumulated fear and stress. Marcus stood quietly beside her, not trying to comfort her with empty words, just present. When she finally regained some composure, wiping at her face with shaking hands, she looked at him and said she didn't know how to thank him. He'd saved her job, her security, her future. She owed him everything. Marcus shook his head firmly. He told her she owed him nothing, that what he'd done was simply repaying a debt he'd carried for 20 years. She'd saved him and Ethan when they'd been desperate children with nowhere to turn. She'd given them food and dignity and a moment of kindness in a dark time. If anything, his actions had only begun to balance the scale. Maria protested that what she'd done had been so small, just giving 2 boys some extra food. Marcus smiled, a real smile that softened his usually serious face. He said that was exactly the point. She'd thought it was small, had probably forgotten about them within weeks of their departure. But for him and Ethan, it had been everything. It had been proof that there were still good people in the world, that they mattered enough for someone to care. That memory had sustained them through the hard years that followed. They'd both built successful lives, yes, but they'd never forgotten where they'd come from or the people who'd helped them along the way. This wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It was about honoring the simple human kindness that made survival possible. They talked for a long time in that parking lot, not about the drama or the politics, but about life, about choices, about what really mattered. Marcus told her about Ethan's children, about how he and his brother had agreed their own kids would grow up understanding the importance of helping others, of seeing people's humanity rather than their circumstances. Maria told him about her daughter Rosa, about how proud she was that Rosa had chosen nursing, a profession of service and care. They talked about the children they'd both tried to help in their different ways, about the small acts that accumulated into a life well lived. Finally, exhausted and emotionally drained, Maria said she needed to go home to process everything that had happened. Marcus walked her to her car, an old sedan that had seen better days but still ran reliably. Before she got in, she turned to him one more time and said something that had been on her mind throughout this entire ordeal. She told him that while she was grateful beyond words for what he'd done, she hoped he understood that she couldn't have lived with herself if keeping her job had come at the cost of his corruption or wrongdoing. If he'd done something illegal or unethical to make this happen, she would have had to walk away. Marcus looked at her with an expression of deep respect. He assured her that everything he'd done had been above board. He'd applied pressure, yes, but through legal means. Public scrutiny, media attention, legitimate questions about spending, all tools available to any citizen. The corruption he'd helped expose had existed independently of his campaign. He'd simply shown a light on it. The board's decision to reverse the food services cuts had been their choice, made in response to community pressure and the realization that their priorities had been wrong. Maria nodded, satisfied. She got in her car and drove home, watching Marcus's figure in her rearview mirror as he stood in the parking lot, making sure she got safely on her way. The weeks that followed the board meeting brought changes both subtle and profound. Dr. Harold Vance submitted his resignation 3 days after the emergency session, citing personal reasons and a desire to pursue other opportunities. Nobody believed the official story. Everyone understood he'd been forced out, his authority so thoroughly undermined that continuing in the position had become untenable. The interim superintendent appointed by the board was a woman named Dr. Lisa Chun, who'd spent 20 years as a principal before moving into district administration. Her first actions were telling. She met with every department, including food services, asking workers what they needed to do their jobs better. She attended school lunches, sitting with students and staff, making herself visible and accessible. Patricia Hendricks also departed, though her exit was quieter. She requested a transfer to another school, and the request was granted quickly. The woman who replaced her as cafeteria manager at Lincoln Elementary was someone Maria had worked with years before. Janet Morrison, a practical and fair-minded supervisor who treated her staff with respect. On Janet's first day, she'd called Maria into the office and told her that the write-up in her file had been reviewed and removed. There was no evidence it had been justified, and it appeared to have been motivated by factors unrelated to Maria's actual performance. Maria's record was clean again, 27 years of exemplary service unmarred by false accusation. The atmosphere in the cafeteria transformed almost overnight. The tension that had made every day feel like walking through a minefield dissipated. Workers who'd been afraid to speak to Maria now greeted her warmly. apologizing for their silence during the difficult months. Jennifer, the young woman who'd signed the incident report about the yogurt, came to Maria in tears, begging for forgiveness. Maria hugged her and told her there was nothing to forgive, that she understood Jennifer had been in an impossible position. What mattered was that they could all move forward now, could go back to focusing on what really mattered, which was feeding the children who came through their line every day. The children themselves had been largely oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around. For them, the cafeteria was simply the place where they got their lunch, where Miss Maria smiled at them and sometimes snuck them extra cookies. But some of the older students had picked up on the tension, had heard their parents talking about the school board meetings and the news coverage. They began treating Maria differently. Not just as the lunch lady, but as someone important, someone who'd been at the center of something significant. It embarrassed her, but also touched her deeply. These children were learning a lesson about standing up for what was right, about how ordinary people could matter. Marcus had kept his distance in the immediate aftermath of the board meeting, understanding that Maria needed space to process everything and to return to some semblance of normalcy. But 3 weeks later, he called and asked if she'd be willing to have lunch with him, not in the school cafeteria, but somewhere they could talk privately. Maria agreed, and they met at a quiet restaurant midway between the school and his office. It was the first time they'd had a real conversation since the parking lot discussion after the board meeting, and Maria found herself curious about what he wanted to discuss. Over lunch, Marcus told her about the changes happening at the district level. The Community Oversight Committee was being formed, with representatives from parent groups, teachers, and community organizations. Marcus had been asked to serve on it but had declined, saying his involvement had been about a specific issue, and now that it was resolved, it was time for him to step back and let the community manage its own affairs. He'd meant what he said about the donation, though. $2 million had been transferred to a restricted fund, with Janet Morrison appointed as one of the advisors, ensuring the cafeteria equipment upgrades were done properly and met the actual needs of the workers using them. But the real reason for the lunch, Marcus explained, was that he wanted to arrange something special. Ethan was flying in the following month, bringing his wife and 2 sons. It had been planned as a regular visit, but now Ethan wanted to meet Maria again, wanted to introduce his family to the woman who'd helped him when he'd been a scared little boy. Marcus asked if Maria would be willing to join them for an afternoon, perhaps at a park where the children could play and they could all spend time together. Maria felt tears prick at her eyes again. She would be honored, she told him. She'd thought about those 2 boys so many times over the years, and the chance to see Ethan again, to meet his family, felt like closing a circle that had been left open for 2 decades. They discussed the logistics, the date and time and place, but then their conversation drifted to deeper topics. Marcus asked Maria what she planned to do now, whether she'd work until she qualified for full Social Security or if she might retire earlier now that the immediate financial crisis had passed. Maria admitted she wasn't sure. The stress of the past months had taken a toll, had made her feel older than her 62 years. But the idea of leaving the cafeteria, of not being there for the children who needed her, felt wrong. She'd been doing this work for so long that she wasn't sure who she was without it. Marcus understood that, he said. Identity was so often tied to work, to the roles we played and the purpose we served. But he hoped she knew that her value wasn't just in what she did professionally. She'd touched countless lives in ways that would ripple forward long after she stopped serving school lunches. Maria appreciated the sentiment but remained practical. She said she'd probably work another few years, build up her savings a bit more, make sure she had a solid cushion for retirement. Marcus nodded, but then said something that surprised her. He told her he'd been thinking about legacy, about how wealth should be used. He'd made more money than he could spend in multiple lifetimes, and while he had charitable foundations and donated generously to various causes, he'd been considering a more direct approach to honoring the people who'd made a difference in his life. He wanted to establish a fund for Maria, an endowment that would provide her with financial security regardless of when she chose to retire. It wasn't charity, he insisted, before she could protest. It was recognition. Compensation for the incalculable value of what she'd done for him and Ethan. Maria's immediate instinct was to refuse. She'd been raised to be independent, to earn her own way, to never accept handouts. But Marcus countered every objection with patient logic. He wasn't offering her a handout. He was offering her freedom, the freedom to make choices based on what felt right rather than what financial necessity demanded. If she wanted to keep working, that was fine. If she wanted to retire and volunteer or travel, or spend time with her daughter and future grandchildren, she should have that option. The fund would simply ensure that she had choices, that the woman who'd given so much to others could finally put herself first without worrying about money. The conversation lasted through lunch and well into the afternoon. Maria found herself talking about dreams she'd barely admitted to herself. She'd always wanted to take a real vacation, not just a few rush days off, but a proper trip somewhere beautiful. She'd always wanted to take cooking classes to learn techniques beyond institutional food service. She'd thought about volunteering at a homeless shelter, using her skills to feed people who needed it most. These were small dreams, modest in their scope, but they were hers. Marcus listened intently and said that all of those things were possible now, that she should start thinking about her life in terms of possibilities rather than constraints. By the time they parted, Maria had reluctantly agreed to accept Marcus's gift. It went against every instinct she had, but she also recognized the truth in what he'd said. This wasn't about taking advantage of his wealth. It was about accepting that sometimes people wanted to give back, wanted to honor debts of gratitude that couldn't be measured in conventional terms. She would work as long as she felt called to do so, but when the time came to retire, she'd be able to do it with dignity and security. The knowledge lifted a weight she'd been carrying for years, a constant low-level anxiety about the future that had colored every decision she made. The month passed quickly. Maria found herself looking forward to meeting Ethan again with an anticipation that surprised her. She'd thought about both boys so often over the years, had wondered what had become of them. Knowing they'd both thrived, that they'd built good lives despite the difficult start, filled her with a joy she hadn't expected. It validated something she'd always believed, that kindness mattered, that small acts of decency could be the difference between a child who gave up and a child who kept fighting. The afternoon of the reunion was perfect, one of those early autumn days when the weather seemed designed to make people happy. The park Marcus had chosen was beautiful, with mature trees providing shade, a playground for the children, and plenty of open space. Maria arrived first, parking her old sedan among the much nicer vehicles in the lot and feeling a moment of self-consciousness, before reminding herself that she had every right to be there. She walked to the picnic area where they'd agreed to meet and saw Marcus already waiting, setting up a table with food and drinks. He saw her and waved, his formal business demeanor completely absent. He was dressed casually in jeans and a polo shirt, looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. Then she heard children's laughter and turned to see a family approaching. The man was in his late 30s, tall and lean with kind eyes that she recognized even though his face had changed completely from the 7-year-old she'd known. Ethan. He was holding hands with a small boy on one side and had his other arm around a woman who must be his wife. A slightly older boy ran ahead, chasing a butterfly with unself-conscious joy. As they got closer, Ethan's eyes found Maria's, and his face lit up with a smile so bright it made him look like that little boy again for just a moment. He picked up his pace, pulling his family along, and when he reached Maria, he did something that surprised her. He put down the hand he'd been holding and wrapped her in a hug. A real hug that conveyed 20 years of gratitude and affection. Maria hugged him back. This man who'd been a hungry child in her cafeteria line felt tears streaming down her face for what felt like the 100th time in recent weeks. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan introduced his wife Sophia, a lovely woman with warm eyes and an easy smile. Then he called to his sons and the boys came running over, the older one about 9 and the younger about 7. Almost exactly the ages Ethan and Marcus had been when Maria had first met them. Ethan introduced them, Nathan and Marco, and Maria felt her breath catch at the significance of those names. Nathan for Marcus, Marco for Marcus's middle name, which was what he went by now. These boys were named for the two versions of their uncle, the scared child and the successful man. It was a beautiful tribute, a way of honoring the journey and ensuring the next generation remembered where they'd come from. The boys looked at Maria with curiosity, clearly having been told she was someone important but not quite sure why. Ethan crouched down to their level and told them something that made Maria's heart swell. He said this was the lady who'd fed him and Uncle Marcus when they'd been little boys and needed help. He told them she was a hero and that heroes weren't always people in capes who did big obvious things. Sometimes heroes were people who did small kind things when nobody was watching, and those might be the most important heroes of all. The afternoon unfolded with the easy warmth of people who were meant to be in each other's lives. They spread blankets on the grass and Marcus laid out the food he'd brought, an impressive spread from an upscale deli. But Maria had brought something too, something she'd spent the previous evening preparing. She pulled containers from her bag and opened them to reveal homemade empanadas, the recipe passed down from her own grandmother. She'd made them with love, the same way she approached feeding the children in her cafeteria, and watching everyone bite into them and exclaim over how delicious they were filled her with quiet satisfaction. This was her gift, her way of giving back, and it was received with genuine appreciation. The children played on the playground equipment while the adults sat and talked. Sophia turned out to be delightful company, warm and funny and clearly devoted to her family. She told Maria stories about Ethan as a father, about how he never forgot what it was like to be a child in need, how he volunteered at food banks and made sure his sons understood that they were fortunate and had responsibilities to help others. She said Ethan talked about those months at Lincoln Elementary often, about how a simple act of kindness from a cafeteria worker had shown him that the world still contained goodness when everything else in his life felt dark and uncertain. Marcus and Ethan reminisced about their childhood, not dwelling on the hardships, but rather celebrating the moments of light that had helped them through. They talked about the aunt who'd tried her best despite being overwhelmed. They talked about teachers who'd been patient with them. They talked about foster families, some good and some less so, and how they'd learned something from every situation. But when they talked about Maria, their voices took on a special quality, a reverence that embarrassed her but also touched her deeply. They both credited her with showing them that dignity didn't have to be earned, that they deserved to be treated with respect and kindness regardless of their circumstances. Maria listened and realized that what she'd done had been even more important than she'd understood at the time. She'd thought she was just feeding hungry children, which was significant enough, but what she'd really done was affirm their humanity at a moment when they'd felt invisible and worthless. She'd seen them, really seen them, and treated them as if they mattered. For children in crisis, that recognition could be the difference between hope and despair. It was a humbling realization, understanding that her quiet daily work had carried such weight for these two boys who'd grown into remarkable men. As the afternoon wore on, young Nathan and Marco warmed to Maria, drawn by the same quality that had made thousands of children trust her over the years. She had a gift for talking to children, for making them feel heard and valued. She asked them about school, their friends, their interests, and listened to their answers with genuine attention. Marco, the younger one, told her about how he wanted to be an architect like his dad when he grew up. Nathan, more serious like his uncle, said he wanted to help people who didn't have enough food. Maria smiled at that and told him it was a noble goal, that the world needed more people who cared about others. Ethan overheard this exchange and caught Maria's eye. He mouthed the silent thank you, and she understood what he meant. His sons were growing up with values of service and compassion, a direct legacy of the kindness they'd never personally experienced, but had been told about their entire lives. The ripple effects of that autumn 20 years ago were continuing into a new generation. It was the kind of immortality that mattered, not fame or monuments, but the passing on of goodness from one person to another, creating an unbroken chain of human decency. As the sun began to lower in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the park, the conversation turned to the future. Marcus told Maria about several initiatives he was planning, charitable projects focused on ensuring no child went hungry in their community. He wanted to establish programs that provided not just free meals but dignified access to food. Systems where children could eat without having to prove poverty or endure the stigma of being identified as needy. He asked Maria if she'd be willing to consult on these programs, to bring her decades of experience and her understanding of what children actually needed. She agreed immediately, energized by the prospect of continuing to make a difference even after her eventual retirement. Ethan added that he was working with several nonprofits on affordable housing projects, designing spaces that fostered community and dignity rather than just providing basic shelter. He said the experience of housing instability as a child had shaped everything about how he approached architecture. He wanted to create homes that gave families a foundation that helped them build lives rather than just survive. The brothers had both channeled their difficult past into purposeful futures, using their success to address the very problems they'd once faced. Maria felt immensely proud of them, as if they were her own sons rather than children she'd known for only a brief period 2 decades earlier. The question of legacy hung in the air between them all, unspoken but present. Maria had spent her life in service, helping children one meal at a time, and had never expected recognition or reward. Yet here she sat, surrounded by the tangible evidence that her work had mattered profoundly. Marcus and Ethan had succeeded not just despite their difficult childhoods, but in some ways because of them, because people like Maria had shown them that kindness existed and was worth emulating. Their own children were being raised with these same values, taught to see people's humanity rather than their circumstances. The impact of those few months in autumn 1995 would echo forward for generations. As the gathering began to wind down, the children tired from playing, Sophia gathering their thing, Maria felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The fear and anxiety that had dominated her life for months were gone, replaced by gratitude and possibility. She had her job, her security, her dignity intact. More than that, she had confirmation that her life's work had mattered in ways she'd never imagined. The simple act of feeding 2 hungry boys, of treating them with respect and kindness, had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately save her from losing everything she'd worked for. The symmetry of it was almost poetic. Before they parted, Ethan gave Maria a gift. It was a leather-bound photo album, beautifully made, filled with pictures of him and Marcus growing up. Early photos showed them as the scared children she remembered, then progressing through their teen years, their young adulthood, their achievements and milestones. There were photos of Ethan's wedding, of his children being born, of Marcus accepting business awards and giving speeches. Tucked into the front cover was a handwritten letter from both brothers, expressing their gratitude in words that made Maria cry yet again when she read them later that evening. They wrote about how her kindness had been a light in their darkness, how they'd carried the memory of her compassion through every challenge they'd faced, how they hoped she knew that she'd saved them in ways that went far beyond physical hunger. Maria drove home that evening feeling fuller than she'd felt in years, not from food, but from connection and purpose and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. She thought about all the children she'd served over the decade, wondered how many of them carried memories of small kindnesses she'd shown, how many of them might think of her when faced with opportunities to help others. She'd never know the full extent of her impact, and that was okay. The point wasn't recognition. The point was simply doing the right thing, treating people with dignity, showing up every day and making the world a little bit better in whatever small ways she could. The months that followed brought continued positive changes. The school district, under new leadership, implemented reforms that prioritized people over bureaucratic efficiency. Workers across all departments felt more valued, more secure. The Community Oversight Committee ensured transparency in spending decisions. Gerald Sampson's consulting firm was quietly removed from the approved vendors list, and competitive bidding processes were strengthened. Dr. Vance's replacement brought a collaborative approach that emphasized service to students and respect for all staff members. The culture was shifting, slowly but undeniably. towards something healthier. Maria continued working at Lincoln Elementary, but now without the cloud of fear and uncertainty that had hung over her. She worked because she wanted, because the children needed her, because this was still where she felt most useful and fulfilled. But she also began allowing herself to dream about eventual retirement, about the trips she'd take and the hobbies she'd pursue. She signed up for a cooking class, something she'd never had time or money for before. She planned a visit to see her daughter Rosa, a longer stay than her usual brief trips. She started thinking about volunteering at the homeless shelter, using her skills to serve those who needed it most. The story of Maria Santos and Marcus Thorne spread beyond their immediate community. Local news picked it up, then regional outlets, then a few national publications interested in heartwarming human interest stories. Maria gave a few interviews reluctantly, always uncomfortable with attention, but understanding that the story carried an important message. She emphasized in every interview that she wasn't special, that she'd simply done what any decent person would do. But that was precisely what made the story powerful. Ordinary people could have extraordinary impact through simple acts of kindness. Everyone had the ability to see others' humanity, to extend help without judgment, to be the person someone else needed in a difficult moment. Years from now, when Maria finally did retire, she would look back on this chapter of her life with mixed emotion. The fear and stress had been very real, the threat to her security genuine and terrifying, but it had also brought unexpected gifts. The reunion with Marcus and Ethan, the knowledge that her work had mattered more than she'd known, the financial security that allowed her to make choices based on desire rather than desperation. Most importantly, it had reinforced her belief in the power of simple human kindness, the way small acts could ripple outward in ways that were impossible to predict or measure. The story of a woman who gave free food to hungry children and the billionaire who confronted her years later to save her job became more than just a news item. It became a reminder of something essential and easily forgotten in a world that often felt harsh and uncaring. We are all connected. The kindness we show to others, especially to those who are vulnerable and struggling, creates bonds that transcend time and circumstance. And what we give comes back to us not always in direct or predictable ways, but through the mysterious interconnectedness of human lives lived with decency and compassion. Maria Santos had spent her career believing that feeding children was simply her job, nothing more remarkable than any other form of honest work. But in the end, she learned that there are no small acts of kindness, only acts whose full impact we cannot yet see. Those two hungry boys she'd fed 2 decades ago had grown into men who remembered, who valued what she'd given them, and who'd moved heaven and earth to ensure she was protected when she needed it. Her simple gift of food and dignity had been returned to her, multiplied 1,000-fold, in security, in gratitude, in the deep satisfaction of knowing her life had mattered. If this story has moved you, if it's reminded you of the power each of us has to make a difference in someone else's life, please share it with others who might need that reminder. We live in challenging times, and it's easy to feel that individual actions don't matter, that the problems are too big and our resources too small. But Maria's story proves otherwise. One person, acting from simple human compassion, can change lives in ways that echo across decades. Every one of us has opportunities every day to see someone else's struggle, to extend a hand, to offer dignity and kindness without expecting anything in return. These moments matter more than we know. Some acts of kindness are so small they barely register in the moment, yet their ripples can travel across decades, reshaping entire lives in ways no one could predict. For Maria Santos, a 42-year-old cafeteria worker at Lincoln Elementary School, compassion wasn't a grand gesture, it was simply who she was. For Marcus Thorne, one of the wealthiest men in the country, gratitude was a debt he'd carried for 20 years, waiting for the day he could finally repay it. Their worlds should never have intersected again after that difficult autumn when Maria quietly fed 2 hungry boys who had nothing. But fate has a way of circling back, of demanding that debts be acknowledged and stories be completed. This isn't a tale about charity. It's about the invisible threads that connect us all, about how a woman's simple act of feeding 2 forgotten children would one day stand between her and ruin, defended by the most powerful man she'd never expected to see again. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Lincoln Elementary's cafeteria, casting golden rectangles across the long tables where children laughed and ate. It was that particular quality of light that only exists in late September, warm but tinged with the coming chill of autumn. Maria Santos stood behind the serving counter, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, her blue uniform spotless despite the chaos of lunch service. She'd worked at Lincoln for 7 years, and she knew the rhythm of this place better than her own heartbeat. Clatter of trays, the excited chatter of young voices, the smell of institutional food that somehow still managed to be comforting. This was her kingdom, and these children were her charges, even if most of them didn't know her name. She watched the line move forward with the practiced eye of someone who'd served thousands of meals. There was Jenny Mitchell, who always asked for extra vegetables. There was Carlos Rodriguez, who'd only eat the chicken nuggets if they were shaped like dinosaurs. There was Emma Chun, who was allergic to dairy and needed special special attention. Maria knew them all, knew their preferences and their restrictions, knew which ones came from homes where dinner was guaranteed and which ones didn't. That knowledge weighed on her more than she ever let on. Near the end of the lunch period, when most of the students had already been served and were settling into their conversations and games, two boys approached the counter. Maria had noticed them before, hovering near the edges of the cafeteria, their eyes following the other children with a hunger that went beyond physical need. They were new to the school, transfers who'd arrived just 2 weeks earlier. The older one looked about 9, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that were clean but worn thin. The younger one couldn't have been more than 7, his face still holding that softness of early childhood, but his eyes were too old, too wary. They were obviously brothers, bound together by more than blood, by the kind of shared hardship that creates an unbreakable bond. The older boy approached the counter with his shoulders squared, trying to project a confidence he clearly didn't feel. His younger brother stayed close behind him, one small hand gripping the back of the older boy's shirt like a lifeline. Maria's heart clenched. She'd seen this before, too many times. The signs were unmistakable to anyone who knew how to look. The older boy cleared his throat and said, his voice admirably steady, that they'd forgotten their lunch cards at home. It was a lie, and they both knew she knew it was a lie. His eyes darted to the trays of food still sitting under the heat lamps, and Maria saw him swallow hard. Behind him, the younger boy's stomach growled audibly in the relative quiet of the nearly empty cafeteria. Maria had worked in the school system long enough to know the rules. No payment meant no food. There were procedures, forms to fill out for free lunch programs, applications that required documentation and approval. There were systems in place, bureaucratic channels designed to help children exactly like these two. But systems took time, and these boys were hungry now. She glanced toward the cafeteria manager's office. The door was closed, and through the small window she could see her supervisor on the phone, deep in conversation. The decision took less than a second. Maria smiled at the boys, warm and genuine, and reached for 2 trays. She loaded them with food, not the meager portions dictated by the standard guideline, but real meal: chicken, rice, green bean, a roll, and a small carton of chocolate milk for each. She added a cookie to each tray, the kind usually reserved for special occasions. As she slid the trays across the counter, she leaned in slightly and said, her voice low and conspiratorial, that she knew how easy it was to forget those cards and that they shouldn't worry about it. They could just bring them tomorrow. Her eyes met the older boys, and in that moment a silent understanding passed between them. He knew she knew, and he knew she wasn't going to make them say it out loud. The relief that washed over the older boy's face was almost painful to witness. He tried to maintain his composure, to keep up the facade of normalcy, but his eyes betrayed him, glistening with tears he was too proud to shed. He managed a quiet thank you, his voice cracking slightly on the words. The younger boy, less practiced at hiding his emotions, broke into a smile so wide and genuine it could have lit up the entire room. They carried their trays to a table in the corner, and Maria watched as they ate with the single-minded focus of children who weren't sure when their next meal might come. They didn't talk much, didn't waste time. They just ate, savoring every bite as if it were a feast prepared by royalty. Maria turned back to her work, wiping down the counter and beginning the process of breaking down the lunch service. It was a small thing she'd done, so small it barely registered as she went through her routine. She'd given 2 hungry children some food. She'd bent a rule, yes, but only a little, and only because those boys needed help right now, not next week after forms were processed. She didn't think of herself as heroic or even particularly kind. She was just doing what felt right, what any decent person would do when faced with hungry children. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. The boys would come through the line, always near the end, always with the same excuse about forgotten lunch cards. And Maria would smile, load their trays with generous portions, and send them on their way. The cafeteria manager never noticed, or perhaps chose not to notice. The other workers saw but said nothing, recognizing in Maria's quiet defiance something they respected. It became their secret, hers and the boys', an unspoken pact that connected them across the divide of adult and child, helper and help. She learned their names, though not from them. The older one was Nathan, the younger was Ethan. She overheard their teacher mention they were living with an aunt temporarily, that there had been some kind of family trouble. She didn't pry, didn't ask questions. It wasn't her place, and these boys had clearly been asked enough questions already by social workers and administrators and well-meaning but overwhelming adults. What they needed from her wasn't interrogation. It was simply food and a smile that said they were seen, they mattered, and someone cared enough to make sure they didn't go hungry. Ethan, the younger one, began to warm to her first. He'd linger by the counter after getting his tray, telling her about his day in that rambling way young children have, where every detail is equally important. He'd tell her about the book they were reading in class, about the frog he'd seen in the playground, about how Nathan had helped him with his math homework. Maria would listen, really listen, nodding and asking questions and treating his stories with the seriousness they deserved. Nathan was more reserved, protecting his younger brother and himself with a shell of cautious distance. But even he began to relax around her, his shoulders losing some of their perpetual tension when he approached the counter, his rare smiles becoming slightly less rare. As October gave way to November, Maria noticed the boys looking a bit better. Their clothes, while still worn, seemed to fit better, as if someone had found them things in the right sizes. They looked less exhausted, less haunted. Nathan's protective vigilance over his brother eased slightly, though it never disappeared entirely. Whatever situation they'd been in seemed to be stabilizing, and Maria felt a quiet satisfaction knowing her small daily kindness had been part of that stability, even if it was just one warm meal in the middle of their difficult days. Then, as suddenly as they'd arrived, they were gone. Maria came to work one Monday in late November to find that Nathan and Ethan were no longer enrolled at Lincoln Elementary. She asked cautiously, trying not to seem too interested, and was told only that they'd moved, that their living situation had changed. No forwarding information, no details. They'd simply vanished from her life as quickly as they'd entered it. She felt their absence keenly, surprised by how much she'd come to care about these two quiet boys. For weeks, she found herself looking toward that corner table at the end of lunch service, half expecting to see them there. But the table remained empty, occupied by other children who had their own stories, their own struggles. Eventually, the sharp edge of their absence dulled into a gentle memory. Maria continued her work, feeding hundreds of children, noticing the ones who needed extra attention, bending rules when compassion demanded it. Nathan and Ethan became part of a mental gallery of children she'd helped over the years, their faces clear in her memory, but their stories incomplete. She hoped they were okay, wherever they'd gone. She hoped someone was still making sure they had enough to eat. 20 years passed.